Welcome to World War I, the United States, and the Crisis of the Imperial Order. This is Melinda Klein. The First World War, or the Great War, as it's remembered by many, was a global military conflict that took place mostly in Europe between 1914 and 1918. It was a total war, which left millions dead and shaped the modern world. The Allied powers led by France, Russia, the United Kingdom, Italy, and later the United States defeated the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Hostilities occurred not only on land, but on and under the sea, and for the first time from the air. More than 9 million soldiers died on various battlefields, and millions more of civilians suffered as well. Woodrow Wilson, as the new president in 1912 of the United States, had definite ideas about how the nation should behave in world affairs. By 1914, major European nations were on edge. In the summer when the Great War broke out, Germany and Austria-Hungary dominated the center of the European landmass, with France, Great Britain, and Russia offering balance around the former Holy Roman Empire. Once the fighting began, the system of alliances drew most of Europe and her colonies into the conflict. In 1912-13, two major wars broke out in the Balkan states to divide up the Turkish-controlled lands, but war was not considered inevitable by 1914. The assassination of Austrian-Hungarian Archduke in line for the throne led to the World War. What should have been the Third Balkan War rapidly turned into a European war because of the alliances in place by 1914. While the United States remained neutral, on August 4th, Germany invaded neutral Belgium on its way to France, beginning the Great War. By December 1914, a network of trenches stretched along the Western Front between France and Germany. The trenches were thought in 1914 to be a temporary situation to provide minimum cover from enemy fire. Daytime in the trenches alternated between extreme fear and boredom. Most work was done at night when patrols were sent out to spy on enemy camps and sometimes raid them if possible. At the same time, damaged trench areas needed repaired and reinforced before another attack. When troops left the trenches to advance to the enemy front line, they entered a place called No Man's Land, an area between two enemy fronts, difficult to pass for either with barbed wire fencing and landmines. Fighting during the Great War was not restricted to Europe. German colonies in Africa were overrun by the French, British, South African forces, while Germany's colonies in China and the Pacific were overrun by the Japanese, British, Australian, and New Zealand forces. One of the major conflicts that took place was in the Middle East. Here, the Turkish Ottoman Empire controlled modern Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Arabia. British and Indian troops invaded Mesopotamia in 1914 and finally captured Baghdad in 1917. At first, military leaders were not convinced that airplanes could help in the war effort, but they soon changed their minds. The first war airplanes were reconnaissance craft. When enemy fire tried to shoot down planes from below, this led to dogfights in the air. When the men went off to fight, the women were called upon to take their place on the home front. Many women were already working as nurses, teachers, and on their family farms or as laborers. With Europe now at war, women went to factories, drove trucks and ambulances, and did almost anything a man did before the war. On February 21, 1916, Germany launched a massive attack against Verdun, a fortified medieval French city. Verdun was close to the German border and controlled access to eastern France. After 700,000 German and French casualties and dead, by December the Germans had been pushed back almost to where they started. German troops did not take Verdun. This was a year of stalemate. President Wilson spent 1914 through the beginning of 1917 trying to keep America out of the war in Europe. He offered to be a mediator, but neither the Allies nor the Central Powers took his request seriously. Republicans led by Theodore Roosevelt strongly criticized Wilson's refusal to build up the U.S. Army in anticipation of the threat of war. While the Great War in Europe ended in 1918, in Russia the fighting did not end but continued for 3 more years. This is known as the Bolshevik Revolution. During the war, revolutionary groups gained favor and struggled for power. This ended the monarchy in 1917, overthrowing the Tsar, creating a new government with war. By the end of World War I, China was a national state under their new Republican government, having ousted the last emperor by 1911. But the trend in China was not to westernize like Japan, with their motives to industrialize in the last quarter of the 19th century. By the 1920s, communist influences from Russia found an audience in China. By October 1918, the war was over, with Kaiser Wilhelm II fleeing Germany and the new German government signed the armistice. On November 11th at 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front went silent. Wilson had to include on the final version of the treaty a clause that assigned German guilt for starting the war as insisted by England. By the 1920s and 1930s, German radicals used this treaty to rise again against its neighbors. As war reparations, Germany had to give back the Alsace-Lorraine area to France and pay $33 billion. It is argued that the influenza of 1918, also known as the Spanish flu, started at Fort Riley, Kansas. U.S. troops from Fort Riley shipped overseas. In the United States, over an 8-month period until November, it killed 600,000 Americans, the same number that died in the Civil War. The flu virus spread rapidly around the world, eventually killing about 33 million people between 1918 and 1919. After the war ended, the Allied nations occupied the former Ottoman Empire. The former Sultan took steps to westernize the remnants of his former empire. First, he was geographically limited by the Allied powers to what became Turkey. In 1923, Turkey, located in Anatolia, became a republican nation, secular, and introduced European laws. During the Great War, there were many advances in science, medicine, and technology. Advances included, but are not limited to, entry into aspects of natural science, home products, women's fashions, and new ways to wage war against one another.